Nobody told me that we had to tell a true story. It is bourbon, so never let the truth get in the way of a good story is what I always taught. I want to tell you all basically the story of a fishtail at the end of the day. I was fortunate enough a few years ago to be invited to a friend of mine on his boat down in Costa Rica for my 40th birthday. My friend Chris Fisher is our mayor Greg Fisher's younger brother. It's not really a boat. He's got a 140-foot Russian trawler outfitted to catch, tag, and release great white sharks. So we spent a few days catching sharks, catching fish, trying to surf, and drinking a lot of bourbon. And as we sat on the bow of the ship drinking bourbon, I noticed the bourbon in my bottle and in my glass sloshing back and forth. And I turned to my friend Chris and I said, Chris, if that's happening in a bottle, it would certainly happen in a barrel. And if it's going to happen in a barrel, it's going to change the maturation process to some degree. So I suggested we put some barrels on a ship. Chris suggested that his crew catches great white sharks, and it would be a very good idea if they could get into the barrels and next to the shark at the same time. But the more he drank, the more he came up with a great idea. Let's put some barrels on this ship. So I called up our TTB agent, which is our kind of governing body of the alcohol business, and said I would like to take some barrels and put it on a ship, sail it as he goes on a journey and bring it back. They didn't really understand that. They said, you want to export something and import it without moving it. You're laundering money or running drugs somehow. And I convinced them that I wasn't, that this was an experiment. Chris was taking off on this epic 7-year journey at the time. They were throwing a big party for him. He is known as the greatest sport fisherman since Zane Grey. It was a big kickoff that I wanted to go to. More importantly, I wanted to visit these barrels of bourbon on the ship as it went from exotic port to exotic port. So I made sure we put those barrels on the ship. We got 5 barrels down. It was new make bourbon, so it went into the barrel as clear as water. We put it on the bow of the ship, and it took off on this journey. His journey changed a little bit. He went through the Panama Canal, over around, actually it was about 1,200 nautical miles southwest of San Diego, and camped out there catching great white sharks, 4,000-pound, 17-foot great white sharks for the next 3 years. So I kind of put the experiment on hold. I wasn't able to go stop by and taste and see what was going on with the maturation process that I'd planned. Every once in a while I'd get a call from Chris. He'd say, we had a hell of a storm last night. We had to go, weathered a hurricane. The ship got rocked around. Thus, so did the barrels, which is great for aging. He gave me a call after 2 years and said, Trey, I've got bad news. 2 of the barrels, the band said, corroded and burst. I had my own theory about that because I knew the crew. There was one crewman from Southeast LA named Juan who knew more about this bourbon and enjoyed more of this bourbon than anybody I knew, so I called those 2 barrels Juan Share. So again, I kind of forgot about it. I wasn't able to visit him. He called me up and said, Trey, we're bringing the ship back to Key West for some repairs. Would you like to come in and check on your barrels? I said, absolutely. So I called up some members of the press. I had a guy from Forbes, a guy from Men's Health, and another guy from Food and Wine come join me to go taste these barrels. So I had not seen them since the day we left them on the ship. It had sailed around. It had sailed over 10,000 nautical miles. It had actually gone in and out of the Panama Canal 6 times by that time. But I had no idea what was going on with it. So we flew down there, dropped our bags off at the hotel, went straight to the ship, rolled the barrels out, tipped them on the side, took out the bung, poured it out, and what came out shocked me. It was absolutely black in color. It was thick, and it was absolutely delicious. So luckily I didn't have mud on my face and it didn't turn out the other way. So I was very excited about that. And I had to look at it and say, why did this happen? Why did this change so much from bourbon that had been distilled that I'd drank forever and matured in Kentucky? Why was it so different? We sent one of the barrels back to the main cooperage in Missouri and had the scientists reverse engineer it. And they came up with a couple things. One, they've got cooperages in about 20 different places around the world, and they have never seen sugar caramelized like that. All that heat as it went in and out of the Panama Canal just baked those sugars in there. Not only did we lose a lot of the bourbon to evaporation, here we're going to lose roughly 3 to 4% each year in Kentucky. We lost well over 50% of the barrels in that 3.5-year time period. So as we lost it to evaporation, those barrels are porous, and it also sucked in the salt air. And three, and most importantly, the bourbon is sloshed around in the barrel, so it's in constant contact with the wood. So that wood is giving it color, it's giving it flavor, but just as importantly, it's acting as a filter, stripping the stringency of the alcohol. So it went down incredibly smooth. So people who have written about it said it's almost like 3 spirits in one. It's kind of like an island malt because of the briny influence. It's like a dark rum because of the caramelization of the sugars, and it's a bourbon at heart. Or as my friends at the Charleston Brownwater Society called it, the salted caramel popcorn bourbon. So that was, I've been in this business for 20 years now. That was one of these aha moments where I looked at it and said, everything I knew about maturation was based on what people have done previously. And why did they do it as they did? Well, that's what's practical. If you make cheese in Wisconsin, where do you age the cheese? Wisconsin. If you make bourbon in Kentucky, where do you age it? In Kentucky. It's too expensive to move it. And Kentucky has turned out to be a great place to mature bourbon. So it's peeling back a layer of the onion that allows you to look at things and take it a little step further. And we started doing a lot of experiments after that. We started aging in barrels that had been slow cooked or seared or seasoned in different ways. Some of them had worked out great, some of them not so well. But that's what's fun about it. But it also had me think about, why does 95% of the world's bourbon come from Kentucky when you can make it anywhere in the United States? Does anybody have any ideas? The water, yeah. Limestone water. The history. The history was created because of this. Yes, sir. The seasons, the climate. We have pretty suspect climate. This is a beautiful day, obviously, but as you are from Kentucky, you know you wait 5 minutes, it's going to change, which is great for the maturation of bourbon. But when I thought about it, and I benefit my dad's a bourbon historian, I was able to look at why people started distilling here. And they started distilling in Kentucky or west of the Appalachian Mountains after the first tax in America, the whiskey tax, because they wanted to get past the long arm of the tax man. But they were distilling in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Georgia, which all has limestone water, which all has pretty shitty climates. But what Kentucky had that no one else had was the route to market. So when we distilled our corn into a distillate, into whiskey at the time, and put it in barrels, the only container that there was to ship it down there, the bourbon really changed. So people from Philadelphia, New York, Boston demanded bourbon from Kentucky and were willing to pay a lot more for it. So I had a thought, I had an idea, and a hypothesis that it wasn't the limestone water or the climate that made the bourbon in Kentucky so good. It was the route to market. So I spent a couple years planning this, and I took off. Actually, I tried to do it as historically accurate as possible, was reenact how to take bourbon to market. So what I did is what farmers would have done 150 years ago, which was distill their corn, their grains into whiskey in January of 2016. I waited to what would be the equivalent of the spring floods. We launched here in Louisville June 6, 2016, and floated the barrels down to New Orleans. We averaged 4.8 knots. It took us 58 days. We had 7 straight days of 100+ degree temperatures before we landed in New Orleans. We moved the barrels from this tiny 23-foot boat into a 38-foot boat that was captained and owned by Chef John Besh down in New Orleans. We attempted to take off during a tropical storm that basically circled New Orleans for 8 days and flooded out New Orleans and rocked the hell out of those barrels. We finally got it across into Tampa Bay and hit out right when Hurricane Hermine hit. At that time, I came back to the boat afterwards. The barrel heads had warped and popped. I had to screw new barrel heads in Tampa Bay. We got it down to New Orleans. By that time, the barrels were in such disrepair that I had to ship new barrels down to Key West, siphon the whiskey out of the old barrels, 9-month-old barrels, into new barrels at that time, put it on yet another boat, and we got it up to Fort Lauderdale. Well, we had another boat coming from the BVIs to pick up the barrels in Fort Lauderdale and take it up the rest of the way, but Hurricane Matthew came and actually destroyed the boat that we had coming up. So those poor barrels had to winter in Fort Lauderdale. We waited until April of this year. We found somebody, basically we hitchhiked up the East Coast, took another 43 days to get up to New York to complete the journey. We landed the day that we took off, June 6, 2017. So these 18-month-old barrels, again, we got into, they were darker than a 16-year-old bourbon. It is the smoothest bourbon I've ever had. And it tastes different than any bourbon that I ever had. I thought it would taste very much like our Jefferson's Ocean. And it still picked up all the color and the flavors, but it picked up different flavors. I got a lot of honey and a lot of butterscotch, which I typically don't get in bourbon. So now as we try these bourbons, one that landed in New York, and we taste it next to a barrel that was distilled and aged here in Kentucky, distilled on the same day. So they're both 18-month-old bourbons. The one that went on that journey is 10 times as dark as the one that aged in Kentucky. It is much more flavorful, and it is absolutely much smoother. And it showed me that what we were distilling in Kentucky wasn't as good as what was landing in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, because they had the benefit of that journey. And as I've had the benefit of looking at how bourbon was originally aged and matured, it has allowed me to look at how it's not always best to look at what's always been done or what's practical, but taking it a step outside of that to see if we can improve it. So here we are. Now we're taking our Jefferson's Ocean in a different direction. Instead of putting new fill bourbon on a ship, we take 8-year-old bourbon that's distilled and aged in Kentucky. We put it on a ship, send it to 30 ports on 5 different continents, cross the equator 4 times before bringing it back. And we're now on our 13th voyage. Hopefully the hurricanes that are out in the Atlantic right now aren't going to take any of those off the ship. But the beautiful thing about it, it's looking at not how things have always done, but tipping our hat and our tradition to them, but trying to take it into the next direction to make it better. So thank you all. I appreciate it.